down and you'll go back to the situation before. And then you had the member of the Labour Party who said, rubbish, twice rubbish, because of course we Social Democrats, we realize all sorts of things which these Marxists says we couldn't realize. We did universal suffrage, we did the social security system, we did all the labor legislation we have. So, of course it is feasible, we can do it, we the Social Democrats. But it's an awful idea, a totally unacceptable idea, because the right to an income must be linked to the performance of labor. Because there are some people who are unable to work because they are disabled, there are people who are too old, there are people who are too young, there are people who try to find a job and who can't find one, and these people can be entitled to an income as long as they don't work. But the people who choose not to work should not have access to any income. That would be a scandal. And so you have this old objection that comes in many forms, that comes from the left as well as from the right. What can you answer to that? Yeah. Well, I think there are basically two strategies. One is a sort of ad hominem strategy, and sort of that says, okay, let's agree that justice consists in some sort of proportionality between income and work, income and effort. But don't you think, there were some figures about that in the film, that a lot of work, productive activity that we are doing for others, that are essential to society, don't you think that a significant proportion of this activity, of this work, is now completely unpaid, unwaged? People who do a lot of things unpaid, of course within the household, looking after children, increasingly looking after elderly, very frail elderly people, looking after your neighbors, helping organize things for the neighborhood. All these things are not paid, and it's good that they shouldn't be paid, because you should be able to tap on this altruism, on the feeling of solidarity, etc., and you shouldn't turn every single productive activity into a waged activity, every single contributor to the general welfare into civil servant or into a waged laborer. So there is a lot of work that is currently unpaid, and what you would do with a basic income is just give a sort of minimum level of economic autonomy, a sort of minimum level of livelihood to all those people who perform unpaid work now and don't have any income by virtue of that. And so, of course, by giving an unconditional basic income, some people will get an income who really don't do anything at all in their life, just spend their lives in front of television. But these are a few pathological cases who have problems of some other sort, and they are such a small minority that it would cost far more to try to control and activate them than just giving them an income. And at the same, so that you in fact, and this first argument consists in saying, even if justice is a matter of proportionality between income and labor, basic income, others' basic income is progress, even in those terms. And because you're giving income to some people, or higher income to people who do a lot of unpaid productive work, while not giving a significant income to anyone who is really a permanent lazy person throughout his or her life. That's one argument. And then there is a second line of argument, which is a sort of more the first best. In the first case, you say, well, okay, ideally it would be better to track exactly how much effort people do, but in the real world, because we don't want to do all this tracking, let's go for a basic income. The second approach would say, no, people are really entitled to it as a right. I don't think that the best version of this second view consists in just adding to the many so-called human rights yet another right to an unconditional basic income. I don't think that makes much sense, just to very sort of woolly and boring philosophically to just add rights to rights, a long list of 17, 37, 54 rights, and just trying to add more lists to them. The idea of human rights is a very important idea politically, but it's a very unhelpful idea philosophically. So what's a better, I'll give you just the intuition of this second approach, which in a way was very well expressed by one Nobel laureate in economics called Herbert Simon, who said the following. He said, when I ask myself or ask my fellow Americans how much of their income is actually due to the effort they made and to the actual work they did. Well, when I asked that, I invited people to compare their level of income for a given level of effort. For example, the barber, as we saw, someone who cuts hair, as we saw in the film. Just compare the real income of that person, say in Dallas or in Boston, to the income of a person doing the same amount of work with the same effort, possibly with longer hours, in Calcutta or in Kinshasa. There's a huge difference that gives you some idea of the part of the income of his fellow Americans that is due to the very favorable circumstances in which they have been living. And so the technological advance, the organization of society, the rule of law, all sorts of things to which they didn't contribute in the least, which were there before they arrived, are the product of all sorts of things, including natural circumstances wherever they live, and a degree of demographic growth and whatever. And so, first best justification for a second income, for basic income, and so my best version, I believe, of that second strategy consists in saying, well, you know, we all receive, in particular through the incomes we earn, because of the labor we perform, of the labor contracts we could sign, we all receive massive gifts from nature, from the past, technological advance, capital accumulation, etc., etc. We all receive massive gifts, but very unequally. And some, including in the same society, can get a huge amount of these gifts just by virtue of having gone to the right school, having the right sort of talents that happen to be in high demand at a particular time, having been given a good advice at a certain time, having been able to collaborate well with some colleagues at work, having been appreciated by a boss, etc., etc. All sorts of contingencies in life. And what a basic income does is not take part of the fruit of the work of some people in order to give it to others. It's just a fairer distribution of parts of these gifts which we receive from nature, society, past accumulation, and so on. That's what a basic income is. And so we receive all these gifts and we distribute part of them in the form of an unconditional basic income. That, I believe, is not the only satisfactory answer at the first time, but it's the one I find most close.
Thank you, Philip. And now we are going to the comment and critics and discussion, and later we'll go also opportunity to make questions. Robert, what do you say about Philip's theory, and have you some comments?
Well, Philippe and I have actually worked together quite a long time on working out the arguments for basic income in its most uncompromisingly unconditional form. So, and I think we still are in agreement on this. But there is a way of differing in opinion on certain details. So I think that if you look at the first strategy, Philippe just mentioned, the pragmatic strategy of unpaid work, we have more or less the same attitude towards that. That's a good argument as far as it goes, but it doesn't really answer in a principled way the objection leveled against the so-called scroungers, people who for long periods, as far as they can be observed, act as if they were couch potatoes, right? And that excites people, that generates a lot of negative energy. So if the reply is that there's only a small percentage of these people actually around at any moment in time, then of course that may not even begin to address the indignation of the people that focus on the property of basic income, that you do not need to do anything at all as a matter of right. So the second strategy Philippe mentions, which addresses this problem head-on and tries to provide a clear-cut rationale, a clear-cut justification for an unconditional income, really unconditional. You don't have to do anything. You are not responsible for justifying your behavior in order to be able to claim this income. The income is completely independent of your activities. Okay, so that is where we have a difference, and even there, I would say, our agreement goes quite a long stretch of the path of arguments that Philippe just outlined very briefly. So let me see, recapitulating what he said, is that, look, as Herbert Simon, the economist, pointed out, if you look at what is due to your own effort, your own work in getting a salary, then of course you must be struck by the fact that there's lots of the salary of someone who is at a university or is in an advantageous position on the labor market, is that there's lots of that income that is really fortuitous, that's due to what Philippe calls gifts, circumstances for which people cannot claim any credentials, for which they can only say, well, once I realize that this is so, I realize how lucky I am. The idea is, and that's where Philippe and I agree, that through mechanisms of taxation, so intelligently devised taxation of the kind that you have just heard the people in the film talking about, and there might be a reason for Mehrwertsteuer or VAT as the financing method for basic income in that. So by intelligently designed taxes, we should be able to, as it were, appropriate the income of many different advantageously placed people in society, and then the question is, how much should that income be? So if you put the taxes very high, you may not capture as much revenue as you like, because there is a backfire, depending on the way of taxing, certainly with income taxing. So Philippe and I agree that what one should go for is actually to tax, to maximize the revenue, and then to distribute the revenue in the form of some kind of basic grant. So there we agree. Now the disagreement may come in where we have to look closer at the justification of distributing the tax revenue equally and unconditionally. So there is an argument for equal, because these gifts are, well, let's say you could regard them as a kind of mana generated by the activity of our forebears and nature. So that we also agree on. but the way in which it should be distributed need not be completely unconditionally. And to make that point, I want to say that the notion of these gifts that Philippe just talked about at some length, enumerating all kinds of fortuitous circumstances that give you more income than your effort was actually worth, those gifts are different in nature. Some of these gifts you can only cash in on when you actually do the activity. So when Philippe mentioned, for instance, that being in the right place at the right time and having the right education for the kind of job that's on offer right now, okay, if that's a gift, and we can put a premium, we can put an amount on that, so a gift worth $10,000, let's say, then of course those $10,000 will only be materialized for the person in question if he actually seizes the job and does the things that are required to cash in on this lucky deal. And so you might contrast that with an inheritance. An inheritance is a gift without any strings attached, at least in its pure form. There are also other gifts Philippe mentions in a very nice article of his. He mentions a kind of intermediary situation where you have anti-gifts. That's not anti from against, but that's anti, my aunt. She is going to give me on death, she's going to give me $10,000 as an inheritance, provided that I attend 25 of her very, very boring tea parties that take a lot of my time. And so there you have a job, let's say, that's going to give you the salary in the form of an inheritance, but conditionally on doing the care work of assisting Auntie with her tea parties and passing around the tea, making the sandwiches, etc. So there are different kinds of gifts, and now my point is, getting back to the question of should a basic income be completely unconditional? I would say no, because in an ideal situation you should actually ask people, difficult experiment in thought which Philippe mentions in his book. You should actually ask people, if you were equally endowed with, let's say, token money to make a bid on all these different kinds of gifts in an auction, what would you choose? Some people would go for anti-inheritances. And some people would go for the inheritance, no string attached. And the other people would be willing to do a lot of work to seize the opportunities to cash in on a job with an enormous rent component. My idea is that if you really respect the preferences of these people expressed in such an imaginary auction situation, then you should conclude that there is, yes, there is a component of gifts that should take the form of a basic income, but also there should be an option for people to get more basic income conditional on doing the kind of work on which they would have bid in the situation where the auction is held. And this means that I agree with Philippe that the reasoning that he so ably sets out concludes in favor of a basic income, but it is a partial basic income. That's the disagreement. It's a partial basic income. There is also a work-related component because the very kind of gifts that Philippe invokes are very obviously work-related as well.
So, thank you, Robert. Now we are coming to Søren. You have also commented, Philippe.
Yeah, thank you very much. My interest in the field, I must admit, is basically the very significant contribution that I believe that Philippe and Robert as well has made to political philosophy. And of course I'm also interested in the practical issues and how we implement different basic principles. But I think it's striking in a situation in which in political philosophy we discuss very much how to deal with the abstract principles and how they relate to reality. And there I think after Rawls's work, I think Philippe's work is very significant in the sense that he's very precise on his justification of the different principles, the egalitarian principle he defends, and at the same time he's preoccupied with trying to flesh out what will it imply in terms of concrete social institutions. And I think that it's work like that that proves that political philosophy can be both very thought-provoking and both very practically relevant. And then I have a comment to based on the film and then on Philippe's comments and the way in which he sets up his work. I think one thing that was striking about the movie is that the standard for assessing basic income is not quite clear. I mean, it brings up a lot of different virtues that this idea might contribute towards. And in that sense, I believe that Philippe's work is important in that he, as far as I know, very consistently sets a quite clear measurement, a quite clear standard of assessing whether this is a successful idea or not. And roughly, the idea is that we should assess this scheme by reference to its contribution to benefiting the worst off, that is to increase the opportunities or maximizing the opportunity of the worst off. And I think that raises, that sharpens our minds when we are assessing the idea. And I certainly am convinced about many of the economic arguments that it might be that it might be one of the way in which we could indeed, or it might even be the best scheme for maximizing the opportunities of the worst off. For example, a lot of important work in about universalistic welfare states points out that even though it's slightly paradoxical, then it seems that in terms of redistribution, universalistic welfare states are very successful. And one way of arguing for basic income would be that this takes universalistic schemes a step further and making sure that people who are in a disadvantaged situation actually take up different social contributions and without much administrative problems. But still, of course, even if this scheme ideally would be a better scheme, then of course we also have to assess, and I think that's a big issue in non-ideal theory, what would be the cost of changeover to a sort of basic income. So we will have to compare whether it's an improvement, not only in the ideal sense, but also when we take into consideration the cost of change or the cost of transformation from the more conditional systems that we are aware of. So that's just to point out that I think that one of the major contributions of Philippe's work is to pinpoint a standard of assessment, and I think it's a dangerous path for a defender or proponent of basic income to indicate that this idea is a sort of solution to nearly every problem. I mean, it's good to have a precise yardstick and then say, well, in this way, this might be a better scheme. But inspired by both I move on to another issue that was raised in the movie and is also related to an aspect of Philippe's work. And I haven't really done academic work on it now yet, but I might hope to do. I hope to do it because I'm working on I'm preoccupied in the moment with sort of paternalistic considerations. That is it permissible for the state to restrict people's liberty for their own benefit in order to benefit them in different ways? I take one of the standard examples is to, for example, make it compulsory to wear a crash helmet. So different ways in which people. Another example would be our focus on smoking legislation, trying to restrict smoking for people's own benefit. And Philippe takes issues with paternalism and believes that there's a sort of that we should avoid paternalism. One paternalistic aspect of the laborist focus is that we are putting a lot of money into getting people a job, focusing on being sure that people are willing to do a job, and focusing really hard on people who are in a disadvantaged situation, that they should be willing, and then they should hopefully also get a job that would be an access to a better life. And Philippe believes that this is paternalistic. And I would agree as a matter of definition that it might be paternalistic, but my view is that it's not necessarily unjustified. And I base this on the idea that, in contrary to what was sort of claimed in the movie, that work in the labor market is stressful and deteriorates people's health. Empirical evidence actually shows us that apart from different lifestyles, such as smoking and so on, the absence of labor is unhealthy, in the sense that people, when they go out of job, it's challenging for them in many ways. And of course, we could change the culture and make it more acceptable. I'm aware that it's perhaps related to different stigma and so on. But I think, in contrast to what was claimed in the movie, it's at least not it's not as clear cut to me that we would improve people's health by not being focused on getting them a job. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of interesting issues there about paternalism in the work. But that's just an avenue for discussing his work. And I mean, like other great works in philosophy, I find that I can return to the work and there will be new issues and to take up. So.
Yes. Thank you, Søren. And questions, and I think you must make an answer. So.
Well, my debate with Robert goes back a long way, and I don't think, if we haven't managed to clear up this this disagreement in 25 years or so, we won't manage to do it in 2.5 minutes here. So, so that, though I'll allude to that disagreement, so I'll start with Søren's comments, and starting with the last one. And one of my sort of unforgettable memories in connection with basic income, I have quite a few, was when I happened to be on a tribune in Santos, which is the harbor of São Paulo, with Eduardo Suplicy, who you saw in the film, and with Lula, when in the course of the campaign for his first election as president, for his first term. And so there were all the pundits of the PT, the Workers' Party, speaking in front of a big crowd, and I was even allowed to say a few words in my portuñol, so Eduardo spoke, and then there was the final speech by Lula, extremely eloquent. He was sweating with someone next to him giving towel after towel. My own job consisted mainly in lifting little children brought by their parents so that Lula could hold them in his hands for a little while for a picture. Anyway, so Lula spoke, and his theme was, what we want is not handouts, it is jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs. And then he told this story, which he also must have told in many other contexts. He said, when I was 14 and I was working as a mechanic and I lost my job. Well, you know what I did? I went back to the following day when I hadn't worked. I put some grease on my overalls as my mechanic, and I went back to my mother. I had no money to give her, but my mother was pleased because I had worked, right? And that in a way goes against something that was said in a film where it was said, well, all these people are asking for work in the demonstration, but in fact what they want is the income that comes with the work. But it's in agreement with the comments by the woman working at the cash desk, who said, well, even if I had it, I would still work because it matters in itself. So that I think that's why it's important to clarify. Basic income is not an anti-labor, an anti-work measure. In a way, it's given all the traps in which people, the unemployed, are in a number of countries now through the means tested system. It's a way of enabling people to, while excluded from work, from accessing work, and it's also enabling people by enabling people then to relax at the right time, to retrain at the right time, to work longer in their lives than they currently do. And so in this sense it's favorable to society working, paid and unpaid, in an efficient way, but at the same time in a fair way, in many respects, a less stressful way than is the case now. And that then leads also to the question of the unconditionality and why we need this sort of argument, because it's what is crucial, and we talked about that yesterday, is that a basic income combines two features, which are the universality and the unconditionality. The universality, the fact that you keep the income if you accept a job, is essential for the freedom to say yes to an activity, because you can keep the universal income if you accept a low-paid job or an internship or whatever, and that gives you further training. But at the same time, you need the unconditionality, which is the freedom to say no, this job I'm not going to do, I give it up, and I still have some sort of income. And the two things are important, because without the universality you get exclusion, some people are sort of trapped out of the labor market, and without the unconditionality you get the exploitation, because then you have a subsidy given by the state to people who have no option but to accept any job, however lousy it is. And so, so you could say, well, isn't all we need the idea that what we want to do is to maximize the opportunities, the real freedom for the worst off and the people with least opportunities, and you do that by giving this universal and unconditional income, as Robert said, at the highest sustainable level. And then you have, and this greatest real freedom you give to all. So why do you need all this story about the gift? And so this idea of freedom was recurrent, perhaps in a confusing way, but and not always in a coherent way, but it was recurrent in the film. And so it's, and when we had in Belgium a businessman, still around, but who founded a party defending the sort of Kurzweil program. And so basic income with VAT and essentially the suppression of the personal income tax. And his big slogans, he put a lot of money in it, in streets, was choose your freedom, vote for my party. And so so the idea of freedom is recurrent. So why is it not sufficient to say, well, all we want is to make the least really free as possible. And so with a focus on the worst off in terms of opportunities, in terms of freedom. But the objection is, and that's the objection then on which Robert insisted over the years, if not the decennia, is that yes, but look, if you have a high basic income, you have to pay for it. Everyone has to pay for it in one way or another, possibly with VAT, where the cost of consumption is higher because you have to pay this VAT that goes into the funding of the basic income. And there is then a conflict, a tension between the freedom of the lazies and the freedom of the crazies. That is, between the freedom of the people who say what I want is in fact a basic income as high as possible in order, I call them lazies, but in order to also think, look after my children, be active in the community of Christiania, or whatever you want to do with your time, but in an unpaid way. But the other one, who maybe have the same talents, the same possibilities, say, no, what I want, they are the crazies, I want to consume as much as possible, even if I have to work a lot for it, and so I want to consume as much as possible, and the higher the tax rate, whether on consumption or on income, the more I'll have to work in order to achieve the same income. And so you have this conflict then, if you formulate just in terms of freedom, between these two freedoms, with the people, two people may be equally well off or equally bad off, but there is a conflict. And that's where you need then a standard to discriminate, because it's really about a fair distribution of the real freedom, and that's where my story about the gifts come in, where once you see that all these things incorporated in our jobs, in the rewards for our jobs, not only in our inheritances, are really things we've done nothing for, just gifts, and huge gifts to the people who are lucky to have a good, like me, who have lucky to have a good job. Well, then taxing them at a very high level in order to maximize the basic income is not unfair. It's not unfair distribution of real freedom. But you need more than just a criterion as a standard, than the maximization of the minimum level of real freedom in order to justify them. So I'll stop here. There are other issues that were raised, but I think it's better to leave room for...
Yes, thank you, Philippe. But I think there must be all other questions here. Yes?
I thought it was a very interesting film, so I will ask some questions on the basis of this. The first thing is this idea of the welfare state, because you can say in the Danish welfare state, in fact, there is some kind of basic income with the idea of universal coverage. In that context, I thought it was interesting, the question of how to finance this basic income. And that would be my question, because the movie focused a lot on how to finance it. There was these different proposals of a new kind of tax and so on. So my question would be, is it really possible? Because in the Danish welfare state we have a lot of discussion exactly of this problem of finance. And if you put it up at 2,000 euros, there would be the question, it would maybe be too much. Then my second issue was reference to Friedman, which I thought was very interesting, that it came from the right side of the political spectrum to introduce basic income. And my question is something about what does it mean to political philosophy with this idea of basic income? How do we move beyond the traditional distinction between Marxism and liberalism? Because I think in political philosophy today we need to move beyond this, and I find it very interesting if you can say that the idea of basic income contributes to this. Then I thought it was interesting the question conditional, unconditional, that you also discussed, and this would also be a question. I think myself, in order to solve the problem of lazy, not lazy, it may be an idea to put some conditions on basic income. And there I think we're not so far from the Danish welfare state, where you already have education. For example, you have universal support for education of the students. You have universal contribution to people who have children from the state, and you have universal pensions. So you have some aspects, but that is differentiated. And I wonder whether basic income could be differentiated in order to solve the problem of laziness. Then I think a fourth issue I found very interesting in the film was the question of meaning, because it's interesting to say what happens with the whole society if you take away the motivation to live based on money, so that you don't have to justify your life on earning money. And you can say most of our meaning in our lives today is about to get a position in a society based on the money you earn. What happens if you take this away? Would the result be emptiness? And the movie in some way introduces the idea of creativity, that we would be more creative. But then you could have it on another level. You could say it wouldn't change anything, because there would just be other ways to require social distinctions, so that people afterwards, even though they got a basic income, the whole story would repeat itself as another level, that there you would have other searches to be to have social competition and social difference and so on. So it wouldn't change anything. So that's my comments. Thank you.
Yes. Right. Yes. First, Carl.
Hello. Well, I think what Götz Werner says in the film about that you need an income, you don't have to work to have an income, but you need an income to be able to work. I think that's one of the main points in the film, and it has been a recurrent point of him that he has stated many times over the years. How do you think that one could stipulate simply that it is a basic human right to have an income, just as it is a human right to vote or to gather in assemblies and so on? One could simply stipulate it's a human right. You don't need to argue. Is that a possibility? I mean, we don't question these things. It's one thing. And then the second point I want to make, I came in a little late, so I'm not sure I got all of your points, Robert. But I think it is that in preference, isn't there a preference ethical problem in simply stating that that you said something about that people, it's not enough that you have the gifts, that's talents or ability to work, you also have to pick up and do the things. That's the point. But isn't there a bias in this argument, a kind of preference, ethical bias towards work? That as if it's still a kind of a penitence, a kind of punishment to work. Still, isn't there a hidden bias in this argument? If you know what I mean. Instead of just accepting that it is a gift and you're even rewarded by wages. That's my point. Yeah. And then I would like to return to Rawls. One of my interests in Rawls is that one of the prominent features of Rawls is that he talks about basis of self-respect as one of the most important features as a human being. How do you consider basis of self-respect? How important self-respect is for Rawls, John Rawls. That's a principal point. I think one of his one of the basic ideas he has. And how do you think that will? How do you think this argument stands in relation to basic income? Is that would the basic income increase self-respect or would it diminish it? My argument is that in a society with no bias towards work, in a completely free society where you can, which is not dominated by any preferences, the people who are for some reason outside the formal work market would have an increase in their self-respect in that country, which is in a position to what it is today. And I think so. What I mean to say about Rawls is that if he had really taken his point to the full, he would have. He might have even encompassed basic income, which it actually didn't. He declined. He said that he wouldn't accept anyone surfing for free. But I think that if he had taken the implications of his own argument, he might even have encompassed or accepted basic income, because it is an increase in self-respect.
Yes. In the film, in the way in which Milton Friedman was brought in, because there was, and you can understand why, and there was a contrast being made between Milton Friedman on the one hand and Götz Werner on the other, in terms of funding basic income by a personal income tax versus VAT. And of course, people like Götz Werner or the people on the left who want to support the VAT view have to defend it against the prejudice on the left in favor of personal income tax. And in fact, the part of the film then where they showed me in a debate with Götz Werner in Frankfurt. I had just returned from Japan. I was a bit dopey, and I remember that. But they quote me precisely on the point where I say, well, VAT is not so bad compared to personal income tax. But I think it's the way they constructed that, especially the reference to Friedman, is misleading. One, Friedman did defend the negative income tax and became famous, remained famous even so many years after, because in 1962 in his popular book called Capitalism and Freedom, he defends it. But and he's associated with it because it was a very popular book. But the first one to really develop in a technical way the idea of negative income tax in its basic income variety was James Tobin. In the same period, he published an article in 1967, the first technical article about basic income, and in fact, Milton Friedman himself sort of gave up the idea of basic income quite soon, and it's mainly people on the left of the spectrum in the US, starting with James Tobin, who managed to get the proposal of basic income on the platform defended by the presidential candidate for the Democrats, George McGovern, in 1972. The name and the Demogrant was on that program. It's people on the left of the spectrum in US who defended the idea of a basic income funded by a personal income tax on the grounds that it's more progressive than a consumption tax that anyway didn't exist in US in a significant level, and they don't have VAT in US. So that the contrast between a sort of neoliberal view that where you would fund it by a personal income tax, and then a sort of more progressive view with VAT, that's unsustainable. It's suggested in the film, but I think that's really incorrect. Now, of course, you can have, suppose you have a basic income funded by a flat tax, flat income tax, proportional on income. So the same rate from the first krone or euro you earn up to the last one. So you have that, a flat tax, not a progressive tax, funding a basic income. And you compare that to a basic income of the sort presented in the film, funded by a consumption tax, in particular VAT. Well, the first one, even the flat tax, is more progressive, in principle, more redistributive than VAT, than funding by VAT. With the proviso, which is what I try to express in the fragment in the film, with the proviso that the personal tax today is so full of loopholes, and then separate taxation of capital income and labor income, that de facto, over some range of the whole profile, it is in fact less redistributive than VAT. And moreover, there is the problem of the collection, the so-called tax gap between what you are supposed to collect and what you actually collect may well be smaller in many countries for VAT than for personal income taxation. But that depends on the apparatus in place in order to capture the tax base. And so, but there is an interesting and important debate about what would be the best way of funding a basic income under present conditions. And so, and given the imperfections of both types of taxation. Then, on your second point, which is then about conditional versus unconditional. So I'm in favor, in fact, when I said I'm in favor of the higher sustainable basic income, allowing for the fact that part of this basic income needs to be given in kind, in particular in the form of free and compulsory education up to a certain level, and a healthcare package, access to healthcare that is either basic healthcare that is either completely free or heavily subsidized. Also, under care for the environment, for the public spaces in cities, all this is sort of basic income in kind. And I'm not at all in favor of fully privatizing all these services and these possibilities and giving a higher cash basic income. Then the question is whether you should go further, and partly on paternalistic grounds. So should you say, well, you don't give cash to the parents and then they can choose whether they send their kids to school. You say, we are going to pay for the schools and the teachers, etc., and the kids have to go to school. The question is whether for young adults or even older adults, you can have a sort of slightly paternalistic view, say you receive the basic income, but for example, if you don't know the language of the place where you live because you came from elsewhere, well, there is an expectation that you'll follow a language course. So I'm not against this sort of mild paternalism, which is understood, and so it must be clear that it's not a sort of it's still a gift. In fact, it's an increase in the gift, and because you give this paternalistic care in addition, and for the good of the person, and sometimes most people will do that spontaneously, but sometimes they don't do it. Particularly, for example, immigrant women having this sort of constraint is a way of freeing themselves, of giving them a good pretext or reason to free themselves from an oppressive context. So I'm not a sort of purist on these things, saying it's a human right to an unconditional income, and so therefore there can't be any condition. There may be good policy reasons for softening this. And of course, as my own children became adults, young adults, in fact my sort of tendency to extend the age range for legitimate paternalism tended to increase a little bit. But then there is...
You also mentioned your view that basic income as a periodic sum, rather than a basic capital, is also
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's an important point, that there is this discussion with some other people, like in particular Bruce Ackerman and Alstott in the United States, who say, well, what we want is to equalize opportunities, or give the highest opportunities to the worst off, and therefore you should give, when people reach the age of 18, you should give a big lump sum grant rather than paternalistically to spread it over their life. So give them and let them do whatever they choose. I'm strongly against that, and because it would amplify the inequalities, because then it's all a question of how well advised you are and how in making use of that money. Then your final question, Jakob, which is an important question. And so suppose even and that you are totally egalitarian. Not only you not only give a basic income, but you have a completely egalitarian society. Won't the inequalities take other forms? And This is discussed, for example, in Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia, if I remember correctly, where he said at some point, suppose we have all this egalitarian thing, then people will start focusing on other things as being the top hierarchy, like the quality of the orgasm or things like that. And then you'll lose, and so status will be related to other features of the people, and because what matters in the end is the quality of appreciation, it will just shift to another dimension. Or there is also an interesting discussion on that in Joseph Cairns' old book. Joseph Cairns is a Canadian political scientist who wrote a book on incentives, equality in the market, and he's assuming that we could reach a sort of a yet efficient, strictly egalitarian society where primary incomes would be very unequal, but we would equalize them fully. And then the question is, yes, people, he says, will still be motivated to work because they care about the gross income, how well, and they work a lot, they produce a lot of income, and so the status will be linked to that rather than to consumption. That is possible, but anyway, it's very far from the very modest proposal we are making, which is not total equalization of income, but just a basic income for all. Then, Kirsten, I'll let Robert reply to the question about the bias. I said something before you entered, I think, about the human right approach. I don't think it would help very much to make big declarations in our constitutions about a human right to sufficient income. Of course, there are many provisos in clauses in our constitutions which are simply not implemented because the money is not there, because I think it's more important to act pragmatically, and then starting in a country like Denmark from what exists, including the conditional guaranteed minimum income, to see how it can be improved in order to transform this net into a socle on which you can stand. Finally, the important question on self-respect, and I'll give you another anecdote here. And so, I first met John Rawls in 1987 when there was a conference in Paris for the occasion of the publication of the French translation of his book. And I had prepared for that for that conference, so for my own presentation, an argument which essentially showed that his principles, in particular the self-respect, the social basis of self-respect, the component led to justification of basic income. I'm saying that, and he mentions negative income tax in his book and in an earlier article on distributive justice, without mentioning the particular variant, and so Tobin's Demograph version was also called negative income tax. At the time, I thought he's really on the right track, this Rawls, and so he's the most influential, magnificent theory of justice will provide an easy justification for the basic income proposal, especially because his difference principle, which is a sort of maximin principle, is not only about income, but the way in which this income is given is very important. And so in particular, if you give it in a universal way rather than in a means-tested way, it really also gives people the possibility of working rather than trapping them. And of course, part of the self-respect you can get from that. And also it's given in a non-conditional, not in a humiliating way, as means-tested benefits tend to be. So we have then, especially when you add self-respect, the social basis of self-respect, there we have a straight justification for it. So it happened that there were very few foreign guests, foreign speakers for this thing. There was only Rawls himself, a German called Ottfried Höfer, Amartya Ronald Workin, and me. And of all these people, the only people who got up early in the morning to have breakfast were Rawls and me. So we were in the same hotel, and so for 2 days in a row, I had these very long breakfast conversations with him. I was there as sort of graduate students with all my questions, having read the Theory of Justice. And of course, one of the questions was, is it not obvious that from your principles follows a basic income, an unconditional basic income? And that's where he told me, you know, Philippe, think of these people who surf all day off Malibu. Well, I think they should really provide for themselves through their work. And so I say, yes, but it doesn't follow from your principles, and it doesn't matter, I'll change them. and so that's how. And in fact, he had already in earlier text in his reply to Musgrave, an earlier text published after the theory of justice, it had hinted in that, but then he made it stronger. And in the published version of his own contribution to the conference, which was then taken up in his later book, Political Liberalism, there is then this footnote where he mentions the Malibu surfers and the fact that he modifies his difference principle so that has to include leisure among the primary goods covered by the difference principle. But so his own view is certainly that it doesn't follow, partly because he has the view, and we discussed on later occasion, same thing, he has this view that when work is available, people should do it, and in part because he has, in his ideal of a property-owning democracy, everyone has the human capital sufficient to be above the poverty level through his or her own work, and that will be a self-respecting, achieving society. And so that's his own view, and I repeat, and to return to Lula, and that I'm not at all in favor of a society where we would scrap work, because work, I mean, the recognition you don't get just by cashing in your basic income. And the recognition you will get from other people, from your fellow citizens, you get through what you do for them and for the common good. And that can take the form of paid work. And we need the organization of paid work in order to coordinate, and the price mechanism, the wage mechanism, etc., etc. But there are also many other ways in which you can find recognition. And so certainly I think that once on the question of the meaning, and there are so many things that make sense to do apart from what would earn us an income. I'm personally looking forward to the period when I'll be a professor emeritus, I would say a professor emancipatus, or something. And because there are so many things, there are only 1,000 minutes a day, and part of it I have to devote to the big classes with 530 students, etc. And I find it's important to do it. I like to do it, but I also be pleased to do other things when I will no longer have that to do.
Yes. I would like to answer a question, but take it a little bit of a detour in order to chip in on this issue of basic income and self-respect. So I think this is a subject where there are a lot of philosophical arguments, both in favor and both against basic income as a vehicle of self-respect. And my view has become that it is maybe political philosophy is not the right kind of discipline to decide on this. This links up with a remark made by Søren, who said that in assessing the impact of basic income and deciding whether you want to go along with the very optimistic, vigorous spirit of this film, you have to assess what basic income would be doing to people in a period of transition. Now, in a period of transition means two things. First of all, it means the gradual introduction of a basic income from zero to a viable level that would be supporting real freedom meaningfully. So at subsistence level, that's one aspect of a transition. But the other aspect is more what I want to talk about now, and that's the aspect of, okay, given that we are on the way to have a basic income that supports subsistence at the cultural understood level, so 2,500 Swiss francs, quite a lot, then what will it do? What will it do to people? And that depends I think, not so much on what political philosophers have to say about this, but on sociological dynamics. So what I'm thinking of is one of the striking aspects of this film is that the people who are asked about how they would respond to basic income at any walk, yeah, so the thoughtful professors in Zurich, ETH, and the people behind the cash register, they all have very vigorous, quite self-assured views that what they would be doing, maybe with the only exception was this guy in the at the Zurich station who had never heard of basic income before. But the others, they were, you know, they knew what they would do. But in many cases, I think that people will not necessarily know what they should do if they were given a basic income, and even if they are allowed time to grow into this, then the dynamics of self-respect will depend on how other people are coping with this adjustment problem as well. So, two scenarios. You might have a situation in which people discriminate against against those who live off basic income without doing a lot of work, paid work that is, but you know, going around as bricoleur, going around in the kindergarten and assisting, etc., etc., stuff like that, all very nice, all very happy. And so there might be a section of the people who do a lot of paid work and take pride in competition that discriminate against these people and make life difficult for them. And that might be a quite understandable reaction of basic income if you assume that the majority ruling in favor of this process of instituting basic income at subsistence level, if that majority is never going to be 100%. There's always going to be people biased in favor of the view that work and income are tightly related. So that's one scenario. So the other scenario might be that the people who are using basic income outside of the formal labor market and the structure of jobs are actually the people who, and this is what Jacob I think was talking about as well, actually manage to form a cultural elite of hip people who get together in you know, barns and you know, sections of the city where a lot of things are going on in old ruins, and actually create a situation where basic income, living on it and not participating in the formal structure of work is considered to be very avant-garde, and this might have success. And this will impact on self-respect. And I'm therefore convinced that the attitudes to basic income are going to be determined by sociological processes, and we cannot predict those in advance at all. And in this respect I find the film slightly misleading. Now this brings me to my answer that I wanted to give to Karsten, who asked me, look, you are talking about the diversity of those gifts, and you are pointing out that some gifts come burdened with bad work. And isn't that expressive of an old-fashioned bias that looks upon paid work as toil, or as something that you would not do for free? And my answer to that is, perhaps in the anti-example I gave of the inheritance of $10,000, which you can only get if you attend 25 of
Auntie's very, very boring tea parties. That, of course, is modeled to say the gift comes attached with some work and that work is onerous. But that doesn't express a bias to my objection against Philippe on giving everyone the same sum of revenue from those gifts. It's rather that it presupposes that much work is still onerous. So you might change my example without undermining the conclusion by supposing that the tea parties of this auntie are actually quite exciting. And so then the conclusion would have to be that if I choose that kind of activity, if I choose that kind of gift in the auction, then I should be paying a negative sum for that work. So that means that if you translate it back to the implications of handing out basic income, that Philippe, who has insisted that his job is so great, he should be getting less basic income because he has, as a matter of gift, access to those fantastic qualities of work. And that is not what I was saying before. I said, give people the option to get more money for onerous work, but you might also generalize the example in the way I just outlined, and that would be still a scheme that is against the idea of unconditional basic income as the only solution to the problem of maximizing the opportunities of the people who are worst off in society.
Yeah, about labor or some assets involving liabilities that Carsten raised, and there's an issue here. I would say that even if the job is burdensome, it requires you to take up some liabilities in order to get some out of this asset. Then I take it that Van Parijs' idea is that we can that there's one other group that would say, I'm willing to do the same job as you, so why shouldn't I have a sort of share in that? So I'm involuntarily unemployed. So in that sense, I have an equal right to this kind of asset or the rent from this asset. And then I think that the tricky point is when we have people who are voluntarily unemployed and saying, I'm not willing to do this kind of labor. And I have been interested in that part of the argument as well, but I guess you would say something in the way that, well, they still have a sort of equal right to the assets, and they're standing back in some way. They are not making use of it, and therefore they have an entitlement to some sort of rent. So I guess that would answer some of the questions about the right, but I'm not sure whether you can start by this idea that people have an equal right to the assets, but that's not a question.
Something to that. My picture is really that you have all these gifts and opportunities which we come from outside of us in some sense, and of course many of these gifts and opportunities are not interesting for most of the people. But nevertheless, they are scarce because more people want to have them than those who actually get them. And all this is somehow factored into something like market prices or quasi-market prices of all the assets that can be taxed. So what I'm saying is that whatever you can tax, you tax. The inheritances, the wages, whatever, but in a predictable way. And then you tax them, you fund this highest feasible basic income, And people know that everyone receives this basic income, so you can't be jealous because someone receives it and you don't. No, everyone receives it. The workers, the hard workers, the not so hard workers, the non-workers, everyone receives it. And then you make your choices. So if, given how much the inheritance of Robert's auntie is being taxed, he no longer bothers with these 25 tea parties, he'll just go to one of them and he won't receive the inheritance and he doesn't care because anyway it was taxed at 95%. And so that's fine, and that's fine. It's, and similarly, if some people stop doing, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and coming back with public transport to a remote suburb at 7 in the evening because they have a basic income and that would be taxed more than before on this thing, they'll make their choices. Because there is a constraint that it has to be sustainable. If you give such a high basic income and tax so much all the assets that the basic income is unsustainable, well, there is a downward adjustment and some people will start working again and be taxed less, etc., etc. And so that's the general picture I have. And of course, I'm not tracking in all these things how valuable, how pleasant the various jobs are, how many people would like to do them, etc. I just say, in a rough way, let's maximize this sort of minimal gift, which everyone will receive, which doesn't trap them in a situation of exclusion, and then they make their choices. And they may decide to scrap the tea parties, or to scrap the ambition to become, under great stress, professor ordinaire somewhere because they need to publish or perish a bit too much and all these things. It's their choices, that's fine.
Yes. Robert, you had to... I'm in agreement with this, certainly as a matter of practical policy to a large extent, but the only thing I want to point out is that the logic of Philippe's argument does imply that it would be even more fair to give people the basic income that is attached to the free component of all these gifts and let them have the option of getting either nothing in return for no work, or let them do some work like the care work would be involved. That's what we're talking about, auntie's tea parties, and they're boring, and so okay, so you wouldn't do them for nothing.
Tea party has another meaning.
You might remodel this by saying, well, okay, a part of your option of basic income, which you then can choose, and you have more choices than under Philippe's scheme, is to say, well, I can have more income if I do this specific kind of care work. So I'm not really saying that you should absolutely fanatically track all these different kinds of gifts. However, there are, of course, in society big categories of activities to which gifts are attached. And so it's not impossible to do this, and my example of care work being derived from auntie's parties is a perfectly sensible example. So in the film, people are talking about what you could do with your basic income and spend your time helping people in old age houses. Well, here, with this option, you could do that and actually get more income. And I don't see anything unfair with that. So there may be practical limitations to working out this scheme, but that was not my intention. This was a move in a philosophical debate. It was not meant to be a practical proposal. Question?
My name is Ulrika. I'm not so afraid of laziness of people. In Denmark, in the late 80s and 90s, beginning of the 90s, there was quite a massive unemployment here, which made a lot of different projects in the suburbs. People who were very initiative and doing a lot of things. What I'm more afraid of is the greediness of people. Will they cheat the VAT, which they do a lot in our society now? How can we employ this idea, this dream, which is beautiful? But do we have to do it worldwide, all in one turn? Because otherwise the greediness will take over, and if the VAT is high in a region, people will buy in another region. That's my problem.
And how wages will develop in a society with basic income. And do you think that there's a greater chance that we'll reach an equilibrium in wages simply because wages are not so much decided by a tradition and suppression? Tradition it's often overrules demand and supply effects. So I think that in a basic income society it will more follow demand and supply than in any other society, meaning that it would be more fair, more just, and reach an equilibrium. Unattractive work situations would be better paid, and as it's said in the film, and which is not the case today because we're able to suppress people and force them to work in various situations.
The final question, yeah, so there is often this discussion, sometimes too simplistic, about whether the introduction of a basic income would lead to lower wages or higher wages. And some people say, well, obviously it will lead to lower wages because the employer only needs to pay the difference between the current minimum wage or whatever, de facto minimum wage, and the basic income. And some other people say, obviously, it will lead to higher wages because people will have a better bargain. The workers, potential workers, will have a higher bargaining position. And I think the answer to that question is, well, that it depends very much on the level, on the way you fund it, on what basic income replaces and what is kept. But also it depends on the sort of jobs you are talking about. And that's related indeed to what's shown in the film. And so if the jobs that are lousy jobs, so which people don't enjoy doing, and so the 30% or so of the people in the survey which they showed at some point who didn't like the job they were doing, well, those jobs either will have to be replaced by machines, or their quality will need to be improved, or they'll have to be paid more. And on the contrary, jobs and more jobs can be created, also self-employed jobs, jobs in cooperatives, many part-time jobs, many jobs that involve a lot of training, at a level that's lower than the minimum wage, because people simply can combine it with the basic income. They may not stick to these jobs for a long time, precisely because they are high training jobs that will enable them to move on, but that's all perfectly fine with me. In fact, I just saw that there was one of the members of the sort of German Council of Economic Advisors said, from what I understood from the way in which he was quoted, that rather than introducing a minimum wage in Germany, in response for the protest against the Hartz IV reforms and the Schröder reforms, and so there seemed to be a consensus about introducing a minimum wage, said no, rather than do that, make the social protection unconditional, so that rather than have then a minimum wage imposed on all sorts of jobs, give the power to the people to decide whether they are willing to work under the minimum wage with meaningful jobs. And anyway, some people do, if they are self-employed and that sort of thing. And then, but if the job is not worth doing at that level, they'll decide that they won't do it, and they can only decide to refuse it if they have an alternative, namely a basic income. And the question, of greediness and the problem of taxation. I think, and there are two problems you mentioned. One is the form taken by the taxes, and the other one is the scale at which the taxation operates. As regard the form, quite a bit has to do with the perception of the tax. And of course, one of the advantages sort of implicit in the film claimed for the VAT is that people have the impression that it's the consumer who is taxed and not the worker. But of course, it's still your wage that is being taxed as a worker. It's simply not taxed at the moment that and the point where you are being paid. It's being taxed at the point where you consume it. And you couldn't survive if you didn't consume at least a significant part of your wage. So it's a sort of, in a way, a rhetorical trick that says, well, it's unfair to tax workers because they work hard, etc. And so it sounds socially more acceptable to them, but to tax the consumer, after all, there are people taking something which is produced by others, so let's tax them, whereas the workers are contributing something to be used by others. So I think and given the power of this perception in the social acceptability, we shouldn't ignore it. My own preference would go to something that operated to some extent in Brazil for a while and then couldn't be continued despite the support of the PT, because it required for some reason a 2/3 majority in the Federal Congress in Brazil, and which they couldn't get it in order to continue. And that's what I call a super Tobin tax, which is a bit of a misleading formulation. It's simply a tax on every single electronic payment, whatever form it takes. Even a transfer from your savings account to your current account would be taxed at a very low rate, because the total volume of transfer of payments from any account to any other is a different order of magnitude, a really big multiple of the total income of GDP in a country. And so there is an even greater multiple of value added in a particular country. If you do that, of course, it will have, there's a great tax elasticity, and so there will be all sorts of modification, adjustments as a result of that. But that's the sort of least painful sort of tax, and because it means that whenever you make a little payment, 0.2% or so would be eroded. And you can say, I mean, it's worth paying because it's so much more, so much safer, more convenient to be able to use the electronic payments compared to if you had to carry all this money in your pocket, risk losing it, risk it being stolen, etc. That would be my preferred sort of tax. And of course, it has how progressive, regressive it is, all these things need to be evaluated, but I really think it's worth thinking about. Of course, the problem here, and that why the second aspect of your question is also important, is if you say we are going to introduce that in the Eurozone, immediately you have lots of accounts that will move abroad and take the form of dollar accounts and so on, and so much for the attempt to make the euro an alternative reserve currency, etc., etc. So there's a problem about the scale at which you operate, and there may be ways of trying to countering that, but I certainly think that we should experiment with forms of taxation, and at the same time, of course, restore the legitimacy of taxation, which you can do in part with this discourse about all these things being gifts, and the sort of Herbert Simon argument, make people aware of that, the fact that it's not there, and that they are taxed, but it's not really their income that is being taxed. It's the part of their income for which they did nothing, and so part of it must be related to that, and of course part of part of legitimacy of taxation also comes from a good use of it. That is, to have a transparent use by the public authorities, no corruption, no mismanagement, no wastage of the. And the more you can show that, the more willing people will be to, or the less unwilling they'll be to give up part of their income in order to fund public service. And then in a country like Denmark, it's not too bad compared in terms of the legitimacy of taxation, given the size of taxation. It's not bad at all if you compare to the legitimacy of taxation in countries where the rate of taxation is much lower. But then, nevertheless, so I think the second aspect of your question is extremely important. And yesterday's discussion was about the importance of organizing at least part of the redistribution on a scale that's larger than our nation states, because our nation states are subjected to a single market and all the constraints of a single market of the 4 fundamental freedoms, which put a lot of pressure on their ability to do genuine redistribution, not just social insurance, where you cover for certain risks, or pensions that are earnings related, but the real redistribution from the lifelong rich to the lifelong poor is more and more difficult to do that because of this pressure. And therefore we must also start imagining ways of organizing interpersonal transnational redistribution. Hence the idea which was discussed yesterday of a euro dividend, and therefore also the question about how to fund it, whether we should use VAT or corporate tax in that case.
Yes, for all participants.
Can I just add something now, especially as Robert is here, and with respect to the debate on basic income in a country like this one. So I glanced yesterday at one of the chapters in Erik's book, which was about the early discussion about basic income in this country. In fact, Denmark was one of the countries in the world, countries in Europe, where the debate started earliest. The Netherlands was another one. And just because I'm going to be interviewed shortly by a journalist from the Groene Amsterdammer, which is sort of old magazine. Sorry? Left Weekly. And by way of preparation, I dug out of my files an article dating June 1985, the end of my stay in Amsterdam as a visiting lecturer on Robert's invitation. And there was a big page-long article under the title "The Triumphant Return of Basic Income." De triomfantelijke terugkeer van het basisinkomen. That was a big title. And then, which was a wonderful end of my stay there, but that was 85, right? Nearly 30 years ago. But at the same time, the difficulty was pointed out because there was a picture of 5 people at the bottom, and that said that basic income turned out, or the pro-basic income group turned out to be a coalition of lastpakken and of troublemakers, and in fact you had people on the left and on the right who sort of trade union leader, Rachel Levy, you had Nick Dobbin, someone linked to the Christian Democratic Party, and who were in favor of it, but they were all regarded as somehow eccentrics in their own groups, in a way visionaries, and there were, the arguments, people were convinced by the things, but that immediately created, because there was a report by a respectable institution, the BRR, and chaired then by someone from the main party in the government, but immediately the Prime Minister, Lubbers at the time, said, hey, come on, this is not done. And that was also the case with socialist ministers later, because this idea is an idea that splits the traditional groups. And so you have both on the left and on the right, you have people who say yes, that's the way. People on the right who say yes, that's the way in which the market will work better. And good value. So maybe in some sense a left liberal, but traditional pro-market people say this is how our market will work much better than now. We can simplify a number of things, and then people to have this floor on which people do much better, and including to have a fair labor market. And on the left, you have really these people who are against capitalist exploitation because it forces the proletarians to work, and other people who are against capitalist exploitation because it enables the capitalists to do nothing. And of course, depending on the view, if you take the latter view, you said, well, fortunately in capitalism, it's only the capitalists who can do nothing. Now, if you give the possibility to everyone to do nothing, it's worse and not better. And so that shows at the same time that it's difficult to get the idea across, but at the same time the idea keeps living. And then some people occasionally ask, because they must be asking you, are you not discouraged? Then I say, think of John Stuart Mill in 1960. He thought that universal suffrage was a good idea, even for women. Well, he had to wait for half a century. He was dead by the time it happened. But had he not defended that when no one believed it, everyone believed he was crazy, it would never have happened. So let's hope, and let's hope that we won't have to wait for 50 years.
Thank you, Philip. You have always you are engaging with us with hope, and thank you for the visit to Denmark. It has been a pleasure to have you as a guest, and say thank you to all here to participate. And maybe some of you have not signed the petition for European citizenship. We are assembling this today, and Carsten are going around.
European citizenship for a basic income. European citizenship for a basic income. You can sign here, or you can sign on the internet. I can give you a pamphlet if you're interested.
So there's